Hello, and welcome to the PACE Profitability Analytics Center of Excellence webinar. The Profitability Analytics Center of Excellence is pleased to facilitate a discussion on technology business management. TBM is an effort by leading chief information officers to communicate the cost, quality, and value of IT investments to their business partners and ensure IT is able to drive innovation for the organization. My name is Larry White. I'm a director of PACE, and I'll be your moderator for today. Another voice you may hear is the executive director of PACE, Rafe Lawson, who will be monitoring the chat and the questions and will help us out with those as interesting issues arise. Say hello, Rafe, so people recognize your voice.
Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are, and thank you for attending today's session.
Our speakers, first is Todd Tucker. He's the author of the book, Technology Business Management, the 4 conversations CIOs must have with their business. Todd, please say hello to the audience.
Hello, everyone. It's good to be here. Thank you, Larry.
Our other speaker will be Anton Vandermeer. Anton is a principal of Alta Via Consulting and author of several leading-edge papers on cost management, including the Management Accounting Philosophy series. He's a leading practitioner of resource consumption accounting and has extensive experience with IT, including major government costing programs for IT services. Say hello, Anton.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Larry.
As we begin, I just want to make sure we have a baseline understanding about the profitability analytics model and also technology business management from Todd's book. So this first part will be an introduction of profitability analytics. A key term for profitability analytics is internal decision support. The profitability analytics perspective focuses on causality or cause and effect, the basis of the scientific method and logic. We don't feel constrained by accounting rules and standards. The focus is on real economic impact, the realities of resources, customers, processes, and markets. TBM has a similar focus on internal decision support. The profitability analytics model incorporates the traditional elements of ROI, but not necessarily in a traditional way. And it incorporates the organizational strategic planning process because it is a critical engagement point across the organization. PACE adopts the Institute of Management Accountants view that traditional accounting work will diminish as technology takes over routine and rule-driven activities. Profitability analytics seeks to set a new framework for management accountants to engage across the organization to create information and insight for long-term value creation. This is the overview diagram for the profitability analytics model or framework. The profitability analytics model consists of 3 elements: strategy formulation, strategy validation or causal modeling, and strategy execution or decision making and forecasting. Strategy establishes the organization's plan for identifying and addressing its market and for mobilizing its resources to meet the anticipated demands. Causal models employ causality to model the strategy operationally in non-financial quantities and then monetize the revenue and cost implications of the organization's strategy. This validates or causes adaptations of the strategy. Decision-making employs the outputs of causal models, both operational and financial, to provide the organization's decision makers with accurate and relevant information they need to make economic sound decisions in their business. This is the extended PACE diagram and shows the model of operational quantities, the monetization process, and the financial models, as well as the important strategy evaluation phase of strategic planning. Now let's take a look at a few key diagrams of technology business analytics from Todd's book. This diagram is the TBM Framework. It focuses first on two organizational elements at the top and the bottom of the diagram: positioning IT for value and continuously improving. Then it talks about four core disciplines that are around the edges of the diagram: create transparency, deliver value for money, shape business demand, and plan and govern. There are also four critical conversations that IT needs to have with the business: cost for performance, business aligned portfolio, investment in innovation, and enterprise agility. This diagram is what's called the TBM Taxonomy. The bottom is the finance view. The top is the business view with business units, business architecture, and customers and partners, and the solutions that they use or sell. The middle is the IT view, first by infrastructure towers and sub-towers. This last diagram about TBM is the TBM model and shows the flow of resources and money from the financial view through IT and to the business layers. So with that very high level introduction to both profitability analytics and technology business management, we'll begin a discussion with Todd and Anton. As you have questions, please use the chat feature. As I said before, Rafe Lawson will be monitoring the chat and will bring your questions up as appropriate, or we'll review the questions and comments at the end if there are any that just didn't quite fit into the discussion. So let's begin with Todd, since we'll bring people up to speed on the technology business management. Todd, TBM, of course, focuses on IT, one organizational component's contribution to the organization, but one that I think everybody recognizes has significant and wide impact in today's environment. Where do you see TBM fitting into the profitability analytics framework, or the profitability analytics framework supporting the application of TBM?
Yeah. You know, Larry, it's a great question. I see it playing really a part in all three phases or components of the framework, the PACE framework that you described. In particular, you know, I think that as more companies become more digital, their revenue models, for example, become much more dependent on digital capabilities. And so that investment in digital links directly to revenue, more so than we saw, say, 5 to 10 years ago. So it's really accelerated the pace of, you know, companies becoming much more digital savvy, and then leveraging those capabilities to you know, really drive customer-facing activities that result in revenue. So I think it plays across all of that, both on the revenue side, but then of course on the cost model side and the cost management side of what you described.
Well, thanks. How can TBM contribute to optimizing organizational value creation, in your view?
Yeah, you know, so it kind of goes back to it's imperative these days that companies invest their scarce resources for technology to the best, outcomes possible for their company. And that hasn't always been the case. I mean, traditionally, IT was viewed as plumbing and, in some cases, even overhead. That recognition that it is no longer overhead or what have you, that it has that direct tie to revenue and the ability to compete, the ability to serve customers has changed the game quite fundamentally. And what it means is that companies have to do a better job of making those decisions about where to put their resources. And that's both people, it's assets, it's information assets, it's third-party resources as well for both talent and just innovation and third-party software components, et cetera. So I think it's, again, it's much more fundamental that they get that those allocations of resources correct. And we're seeing a pretty significant transformation of the way companies manage this innovation and these capabilities, using things like agile at scale models as well as public cloud. It's fundamentally changing the way companies invest in technology capabilities than ever before. So yeah, I think it's just become, for value creation, it's become fundamental because value is so dependent on that technology.
All right, thank you, Todd. Anton, you've worked on some major IT costing efforts. What are the critical factors you see to make IT costs explicit and relevant for organizational decision-making and optimization?
Thank you, Larry. I think the biggest thing here is to recognize that IT is an operation. Traditionally, we haven't done a very good job with linking IT to the profit side, the customer side, even the internal customer side. For example, in the ITIL framework, there was no link to the business side. It was just sort of an internal IT focused. Let's do better internally without this link to where real money and real value is added. But there's some developments, and Todd has touched on a few of them. I think from a web-based portal perspective, IT has become a lot more in your face as a customer, and from an administrative contact perspective, and then from a delivery perspective, the whole cloud issue. So IT has become a lot more prominent. Now, the question is, if I optimize this, how is this different? And from a pure optimization perspective, I don't think there's a real difference here, because decision makers need causal information. And this is where the link with the PACE framework comes in. So however we reflect the money that's in IT and the resources within IT, we have to do it in a causal basis. And we'll talk a little bit more in subsequent questions, I think, about the various principles in financial information and in decision support information. But this aspect of causality is crucial to be able to optimize.
Todd, did Anton's comments cause you to have any thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree, by the way. The taxonomy that you showed earlier, one of the things that we emphasize with that and the principles behind it is when you build a cost model, that you connect the top of that taxonomy or the top of your model, which links to, again, revenue generation, like you see with customers and partners on the right, the upper right, connect those capabilities all the way down to ultimately your financial reporting, so that when you make decisions at any layer of this, maybe you make a decision around optimizing your infrastructure services, or maybe you make decisions to invest more in change the business versus run the business or something like that. When you make those decisions, they will ultimately be realized in your financial reporting. So this is not a model that is based on assumptions. It's based on, ideally, consumptive information, which makes it very causal. So I like Anton. I love where you went with that. I think that's every bit fundamental to TBM.
Well, Todd, I have a question here now for you. You may have answered part of it, but I'll answer the whole question and you can fill in any gaps. The TBM taxonomy defines a modeling approach for IT's contribution to business. The Profitability Analytics framework focuses on causal operational modeling first, followed then by financial modeling to reflect operations. What is the TBM approach to modeling IT resources, capacities, and costs?
Yeah, so it's built on the belief and the principle that you can drive a lot of that model with, we use the phrase consumptive information or data. And that's the ideal, that organizations may start with less than consumptive information driving their model, but over time, as they start to analyze the results that they get from it, both from a cost perspective, but also just looking at, resource utilization, things like that, they'll start to include more and more consumptive information or data to support the model. That has a number of benefits. One is that causal relationship that you're describing. So in other words, understanding that when we change something here, it impacts our underlying cost drivers in a certain way. But the other is that by improving the data, you actually improve your ability to operate. So in IT, a lot of the things that you manage, ideally you have good data to manage it, but the reality is that most do not. So if you talk to, pretty much any CIO today who has not made an investment in this regard and ask about their, say, inventory of applications or their inventory of assets or how well they manage cloud resources, with maybe Amazon or Microsoft or what have you, or the list goes on, the data they have for it is poor. But as the result of investing, not just for TBM's sake, but oftentimes it's paired with TBM, you improve that data and you actually improve your ability to operate, to make data informed or fact-based decisions. So I think that causality is a really important aspect of this. Now, the first part of what you described, Larry, kind of the determining, I guess I interpreted that as like understanding our business model behind it. I think that's imperative. Understand, conceptually, and what are the business rules that we put in place to drive ultimately what becomes a cost model or is reflected in the cost model. I think that's something that has to happen. It's not something that we're terribly prescriptive about with TBM and the framework, but nonetheless is very important.
Anton, any comments on what Todd just described?
Yeah, I guess Todd and I have to disagree on certain things. Maybe it's the second question is the right one to go there. So we did a project in the early 2000s at an arm of the Treasury that we all don't like to interact with. They have a $2 billion IT budget. It was a humongous operation. And we used the same principles as what is embodied now in the conceptual framework for managerial costing for the IMA. Yep. And when you do that, you invariably go to the point where the business is involved. You have to reflect how the business consumes these IT resources. Yep. So you go there. The difference I would like to point out here, Larry, I sent you a slide for the TBM model.
Yes, would you like?
Yeah, just to emphasize the difference in how we view the TBM model. You'll see in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a, instead of a cost pool, we have something called resource pool. So this is everything with capacity. Cost pools, and we'll talk a little bit more about language in managerial accounting and decision support, but cost pools are things with pools of money. They don't really have quantitative outputs. Now, consumptive information can only come from quantity-based modeling. Yep. And resources in hours or CPU minutes or disk space being consumed. And that's the emphasis that we put on what we call TBM Plus, which is this very much causally orientated model. And you'll see that the red arrow on the right-hand side emphasizes causal insight. So, but this becomes important now because you are not using financial information, just dollar values, because in the general ledger, the quantities and the dollars have been separated.
That's right.
A goods receipt comes into the company. It shows me the quantity I purchased and the value. We take the money, we stick it in the GL, we take the quantities, we stick it in the logistics system. And never the twain shall meet. This is not good.
Yeah, and I'll just clarify, like with TBM, that is not the case. We absolutely marry those data sets. And the challenge that you have with any general ledger is the lack of consumptive details. So with a TBM model, we pull all that in. And so you have units and resource information about all of which you have at the bottom of that taxonomy, what we call the cost pools. We don't separate and describe any as resource pools, but at the layers above, as you're modeling, what you're doing is you're pulling in data about those resources. So an example, like a common example, is infrastructure to applications. Infrastructure for a lot of companies is, still, even with public cloud, a massive amount of the technology spend, the IT budget. So it's important to understand what is consuming that. And the infrastructure is there to support applications. So having that mapping of infrastructure to applications or infrastructure to services, if you're service oriented, that's incredibly important. So to understand the cost of any capability, understanding that consumption is paramount. So with the model, that's exactly what we do. So Anton, I think we're ending up with the same thing, which is to understand the consumption of those resources along with their cost, because it's both a unit and a dollar perspective. That's what we seek with both, so that at the end of kind of the modeling, you're able to understand that relationship. You're able to know what levers you can pull, either on the business side in terms of demand and consumption, or all the way through to the technology side, which also has a demand and consumption aspect to it. So yeah, I think it's incredibly important to put the resource consumption units along with the dollars to show that relationship.
All right. Well, thanks, Anton. Let me ask you another question. I think it might build on some of the discussion so far. TBM focuses a good bit on chargebacks to customer as a way to achieve some of its objectives. Is there any difference between charging back and causally assigning costs for decision making in your view?
No, I would say not all chargebacks are created equal. Chargeback has all kinds of purposes. I've seen, for example, in global companies, they use chargeback to minimize their tax liability. Mm-hmm. So they use chargeback to declare most of their profit in the Netherlands or in Ireland because the corporate tax rate is the lowest there. The other thing that chargebacks are used for is sort of this internal performance measurement thing where the customers are charged what the market price would be. So an internal service like information technology could actually show a profit if they came in at a cost less than what they were recovering from the customers. Now, in both of these examples, you fudge the real decision-making information because real money is made at the customer level, where you sell what you produce or what you present to the market. And any of these inflated margins in the back end obfuscates the real margin on the customer side, where you want to and have to manage and maximize value. So chargebacks have different purposes. And from that perspective, I would suggest if you're getting into the tax side or into the performance measurement side, have those things in separate systems, a tax system or a tax modeling system or a performance measurement system. Don't put it in the decision support system because you're compromising the decision support information.
Todd, any observations on Anton's response?
Yeah, I agree with all that. I mean, we typically will have organizations build multiple models, and so they can use, a model that's necessary for chargeback or recharge, whatever phrase you want to use, kind of depends on where you're at in the world. And to suit the purposes, be they tax or be they, in some cases, really more about funding in the, federal government. In government settings, you might have working capital funds that you need to recover via a charging, for shared type services. So there's, definitely things like that. And Anton, I agree. I think you want to, focus people on the right types of decisions that they have to make. Sometimes, yes, those might be transfer pricing, tax related, things like that. Other times, what you're trying to do is create accountability for cost and value at maybe an application owner level. So there's, product owners or service owners or application owners who a lot of times what you're trying to do is enable them to be better stewards of their decisions, of their investments and spending. And so you can create the right reporting and model for them. So usually it's a multi-layered, multifaceted situation that we see, and each decision maker can be a little bit different. Now, that said, it's also important to understand how those different layers interoperate. The last thing you want is for somebody to look at something and then see different numbers coming from, another source that don't look like they, drove the costs that maybe they're responsible for, and question the veracity of the model or the report. So, that there's care that has to be taken. And ultimately what we preach is, leverage a similar model. Again, you might have multiple models, but leverage similar data, similar business rules for it where you can.
Todd, Anton, did you want to say something? Go ahead.
I think that, Todd makes an important point there, but I would say if you use a pure causal cost model, you can have these optimization discussions internally. It gets a little bit more tricky when the internal rate is higher than what the customer can get in the market.
Right.
So now the customers can say, okay, but so you measure me on my performance, but I can get this service cheaper outside. And it's really for the overall approach to performance management to decide whether the internal customer, has the right to go to market to lower his cost. The problem is that not everybody understands the avoidability of the cost that he is now no longer consuming. Right? The cost is not necessarily avoidable, especially in IT, where you might have a lot of fixed cost around hardware investments.
Yeah, absolutely. There can be the last man standing sort of situation, Anton, right? Where, if you have business units who choose not to consume the centrally provided shared IT service, the cost per unit of that centrally provided service goes up and up, right? The volumes fall, the fixed costs remain essentially the same. And you can end up with those that are left sort of consuming that having to pay for, a significantly higher rate than they did in the past. So you're spot on. You have to deal with that situation in the way you set up the business rules, what's allowed, what's not allowed, that sort of thing.
Yeah. And so this also gets a little bit into full absorption, right?
Yeah. Well, let me bring up the next question then. It kind of goes in that direction. So I'll formally ask it. This one goes to Todd. Your book and the taxonomy use the word allocation frequently.
Yep.
One of the primary tenets of the profitability analytics framework is showing causality or cause and effect relationships and not assigning cost, resources, or activities where a strong causal relationship does not exist. What is the TBM approach to allocation, and how effectively is causality considered?
Yeah. So one thing I recognized early on was that a lot of folks, when they use the word allocation, they mean an assignment of cost based on a gross factor like revenues or employees or something like that. And it's often used for things where there is a lack of causality. However, we use the word very generally, and there can be different approaches to allocation, some of which are, we use the phrase consumptive, not necessarily causal, but it's the same thing. Consumptive versus assumptive or non-consumptive. And so our view is this, that when you're building a model and you're defining the business rules that drive it, you have to think through what is the outcome you're trying to enable in terms of decision, the outcome that you're trying to make happen. And many times what that means is the answer for a lot is that they focus on both direct cost and then what we call consumed. And consumed, all it is it's where there is causality, but the owner of that cost is someone else. And I'll give you an example, an application. So think of an application. What's its TCO? Well, as an application owner, you probably have in your budget the application developers, maybe you buy some software, maybe there's some tools that you buy, but these are all things that are in your budget as a resource owner, usually a cost center owner. And so they have their direct cost associated with that application. But now think about, what does it take to actually deliver and run that application? Well, there's infrastructure. Usually infrastructure is owned by somebody else in the organization. It's part of somebody else's direct budget. But what you have is you have data that shows how that application consumes that infrastructure. So we gave that a name called consumed cost. So there's direct, there's consumed, and then there's indirect. Most organizations will focus on the direct and the consumed because those are more controllable or influenceable, or whatever word you want to use, in a certain time span. Might be fixed costs, so it may not be something that you can, influence in a short term, but in the long term, they're definitely influenceable. And so most organizations will focus on those. So that's where you get to the causal type costs, are through the direct and the consumed. The indirect, again, it kind of depends on the data sources you have and things like that defines it. The challenge with that is, you expect people to make decisions regarding that, but their decisions don't influence it. So it becomes a choice. Do we need a full absorption type of cost? Kind of maybe a truer TCO, or do you focus more on things that are controllable? Most of the time, the right answer for companies is those things that are more controllable.
Anton, your observations?
This language thing is an absolute maze in the decision support world. Things have become to have 5 or 6 different meanings. Yeah. And it's very unfortunate. In the managerial framework, the IMA tried to at least clarify some of these things. So the use of the word assignment whenever it's a causal quantity-based assignment versus an allocation, which is just this spray can way of spreading money around just to not show excess idle capacity or not have money allocated out. So depending on how you use the words, things then get into, so what is excess idle capacity? What is the extent of the full absorption? And terminology becomes a real issue. And personally, I would have preferred, of course, that the TBM Council got the language clear But I mean, this is the reality of what we face within the discipline, that language is not as clear as what it should be. And that's why you have to have these little sessions where you explain exactly what something means, because every second guy reads something different into the exact same phrase, which is unfortunate.
All right. Well, thanks. That is a significant problem in the management accounting area. Anton, let me have a question for you. Capitalized IT resources are often depreciated over a very short period of time on financial statements. Do you think financial statement depreciation is appropriate for IT optimization and decision making? And do you have any suggestions for modifying depreciation conventions to better reflect IT resource consumption?
Well, if you didn't ask that second portion of the question, it would have been the shortest answer out. It would just be no. But just to explain the answer, the issue here is principles. We've talked about causality as the principle that guides decision support information. On the financial accounting side, there's a different set of principles that apply. The principle of periodicity or periodic principle, and the matching principle. And if you read the documents that spell these principles out for financial accounting, they actually explicitly state that it's not causal. They don't try to accommodate causality. So you have this issue that in financial information, there is an explicit drive to compromise on causality. And the easiest one to demonstrate this problem is with depreciation, where I have an expensive piece of equipment, a supercomputer, or just a very expensive server farm, and it gets fully depreciated. Now, I launch new products on that, which I think is profitable, but as soon as I replace the piece of equipment, then the product is unprofitable. So this is not good for decision making. And this goes back to the statement earlier around, should we be this close when we build a model for optimization to the GL and reconciling with the GL? So there are ways of getting around this problem. For example, in the framework, the suggestion is use replacement value depreciation over the economic life of the asset. That way, the capital cost is always embedded in the decision support information. And the interesting thing is IT is one of the odd industries where typically when you do replacement value depreciation, the value goes up. But in IT, it actually comes down, right? The cloud cost just keeps on coming down, not only because of how they effectively manage the utilization of resources, but because of this phenomenon. So in pricing your products that consumes a lot of IT resources, people will push you out of the market if you don't have this view of the reducing cost of capital in this particular space. So it's crucial from a number of perspectives.
Todd, any comments on what Anton laid out?
Well, just I think it's the point about the cloud is a fascinating one, because companies are moving at a significant pace to public cloud across industries that we thought originally would be very hesitant. They're no longer hesitant, like DoD, intelligence, agencies in the U.S. federal government, and then across private sector, even healthcare, financial services, et cetera, those with significant, concerns about privacy and security and so forth. So it's fascinating to see that, because I do think that is minimizing the need to manage asset value, at least from an infrastructure perspective, and to some degree software, right? So it also includes software as a service and platforms as a service. So it's diminishing that need and really driving greater need for managing cloud consumption at scale. And so that's something that we've seen a lot of maturation about. There's a lot of data that you can bring in to deal with that challenge from the providers. So it's kind of introduced a whole new art and science, I think, for cost accounting and cost management.
All right, thank you. Todd, a question for you. TBM seems to embrace activity-based costing. Is there any guidance on how to apply activity-based costing to incorporate tracking capacities, fixed and variable costs, capturing idle or excess capacities, and generally overcome some of the weaknesses of simpler activity-based costing models that many people have been exposed to?
Yeah. And it's interesting, Larry, like, to be honest, I avoid saying activity-based costing because we've had too many CFOs who hear that, who have gone through their own nightmares in dealing with that. And, whether that's in the federal government or it's in, banking. And so and I'm not saying that they're all opposed to it, but it is a very loaded term. And what we instead prefer is just to focus on what is TBM and kind of keep it to that without applying that particular label. But many of the principles, like you said, are very much activity-based, accounting principles. So a lot of that comes into play. And we do absolutely address through the framework, the taxonomy, the conceptual model, and a lot of the guidance that we provide through our education on how do you deal with things like excess or spare capacity. That's the phrase we use, but idle capacity. And many of the other challenges that you're dealing with. Because, if you bring the right data to it, if you're looking at, for example, infrastructure and you're trying to understand the cost of your spare excess or idle capacity, it does give you the tools for that in a way that looking at that capacity alone without the cost information is very hard to drive a decision around. So you pair, the information about your capacity with the cost, and suddenly it gives you the ability to make an informed decision about it. And the reason that's important is any IT administrator can run you a report that says how utilized is our infrastructure. That's fine. But once you understand the cost impact of that, then you can sort of look at, well, if it would cost us, $1 million to change that situation, is it worth it? So suddenly it takes it out of, we're 20% utilized in terms of CPU and memory or whatever, right, on a set of systems, and turns it into a more financial decision where the trade-offs are much more apparent. So we focus more on that, like the trade-offs, things like that, than maybe labeling it one way or another. But I think the principles are there, and it's a matter of just having the data to drive those types of decisions.
Anton, any comments on Todd's response?
No, I think he's spot on the capacity thing. I would I would add more in the sense that ABC is in the PACE framework. The concept of work and activity. So if one pushes back against ABC, you have to understand some key aspects around it. The one is the lack of capacity and the lack of really resource pools, which are the containers for capacity. The other one that's, to me, as significant, if not more, is the view within ABC traditionally, and because they emphasize the principle of work and not the principle of causality, is the aspect of cost behavior. So early on in ABC, it was very much the view that any cost on an activity is variable. It's all variable, which Kaplan in Cost and Effect equated to avoidable.
Yeah.
And research have shown in the late 2000s, there was a number of papers that showed, and this is where the CFO pushback comes from. People use this information to make culling decisions, cutting products or cutting customers. And you get into the fixed cost death spiral because you have this blended concept of costs. A variable equals avoidable. where every unit of resource is actually the variable unit, but the unit of resource comes with fixed cost and with variable cost.
Yep.
So all of the costs of a resource unit are not avoidable.
Yep.
So there's a few angles like this on ABC, which if you want to make an informed decision, it takes a little bit of digging, but the caution is warranted, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating because, Anton, we've had people that have, felt like, oh, we really prefer a more variable cost structure. And, there's a fallacy to that. It's like you may benefit from such a cost structure depending on, the goals you have around your cycles, your seasons, things like that. It may benefit you, but not always. And the other side of that is we've found a lot of folks recognize that they can do most of their cost reduction on the fixed cost side of their structure. And so I think a lot of folks have this perception about fixed and variable and the avoidable and more controllable nature of costs. They confuse the principles and sometimes leads to definitely suboptimum decisions.
Yeah.
All right, we're in about we have about 10 minutes left, and so I just wanted to check. I have one more question that may take the last 10 minutes. So I wanted to check in with Rafe. Are we seeing any audience questions, or should I just proceed? Should I proceed with mine?
We have one question, and it's actually for Todd. If one focuses on controllable cost items, doesn't the focus then become on what is controllable and what that means? The focus shift away from the true costs of the object.
Yeah, it depends on the perspective is where I would go. So one person's controllable, and again, we, like I said earlier, we're using the terms direct and consumed, but those things that you have the ability to influence based on your point of view. It depends on that. And so one person's controllable is, not controllable for somebody else. But I think what's key is you understand the accountability for costs at all levels, like layers of that model, but also over all of the, the breadth of that cost as well, that you create that accountability. And ultimately, so for example, you could be, I'm the CISO of the company, the Chief Information Security Officer, and I've got a budget for security that for various reasons, we don't assign and make controllable at the, say, application owner level, because we don't want them saying no to security. But it doesn't mean that security cost isn't controlled. It's just controlled by the CISO. It's controlled by policy. It's controlled by a risk management framework, whereas the application owners are focused on things like the cost of developing and maintaining their application, the features, et cetera, the cost of the infrastructure, the impact they have on support, including like service desk and help desk. They focus more on those things because they can make choices and decisions that impact that and helps get the cost for value proper. But again, aside from maybe certain things regarding security. Hopefully that makes sense.
Anton, any observations?
So Todd just did a nice dance around the term controllable, which this is part of the language problem again, right? So for example, in the PACE framework, we don't have the concepts of direct and indirect, because every consumption relationship is direct. Even if it's floor space to HR, it's direct. So direct in the sense used in the general ledger world would be Henry Ford's version of direct, directly related to finished product, as opposed to an indirect cost. But on a consumption basis, everything is direct. Now, then controllable becomes something dependent on the performance management model. Are you being held accountable because you can control it or not? So, I mean, the model should be causal. That's it.
All right. Well, I'll move on to my last question. I I think it's been a very interesting discussion. Todd, TBM seems to rely heavily on GL info, general ledger information. We had some discussion about this. General ledger information is often pretty limited in its granularity. What approaches have been used to improve general ledger information for TBM modeling?
Yeah. And ultimately, Larry, that is the point of TBM modeling. It's that the general ledger, while it is the source of financial truth, is the phrase we use. Yeah, because ultimately that's what you report to Wall Street, right? So we start with that, but ultimately to build a model, to understand the TCO of anything that you deliver, you have to have information that comes from other sources, and the sources vary. But examples might be simply an application list, infrastructure details. If you manage well, you probably have something called a CMDB, or configuration management database, in place. And so having those details, having project details, or maybe you've moved to an agile model and you've got a different approach for, again, term that they use is allocating work. So you might have those details. That's what we bring in with a model, so that ultimately you can understand the cost of things and the consumption of things at various layers. So again, it's one thing to know how a business consumes a service or an application. It's another thing to know how that application consumes infrastructure, support, et cetera, across the taxonomy. There's consumption details at each level. But in order to do that, you have to bring in other details. The general ledger will simply never suffice for that. But we start with it. We do start at the bottom with that in terms of bringing data into the model.
Anton, do you have any observations on that?
I've hit some on the general ledger already. For example, the depreciation problem. You can add any other long-term expense, R&D, or investment and upgrade of equipment that has a life of longer than 1 year. Now, the periodic principle would sort of skew that information away from good decision support information. So in the PACE framework, for example, we take the view, or the view is proposed, that we do not necessarily match exactly the GL number, because if I start using replacement value depreciation, I'm not going to match with the GL, because I want, first of all, causal information. Now, this doesn't mean that it's not reconcilable. At a very simple level, I can look at the depreciation in the GL and the depreciation in the decision support system, and I know why I have $100,000 difference, or whatever the difference is. So it's reconcilable. But the GL should not be the ultimate objective here, because it's compromised on the causal side. So let me end with a real difference with Todd on that one.
Yeah, well, I mean, Anton, actually, I agree. I don't think you're not using the GL through a TBM model to make your decisions. You're using information that is based on the model itself. But our principle is that the decisions you make should be realizable through your financials. And the reason for that, again, is simple. It's that if you don't, ultimately, and it's because we see this too much, that organizations build a lot of their cost management in IT on spreadsheets that don't have an authoritative source of that information, and it's untrusted, it's not scalable, and ultimately the decisions they make, they can't show how they're going to affect the company's performance as reported externally. So we just fundamentally believe that's where you start. But we know that the model, providing the information, like you said, reconcilable back, is very important. Now, you may exclude certain things, and I understand that. And there may be some analysis where that makes a lot of sense, even in a TBM model, to maybe look at it aside from depreciation, or incorporate some other information like replacement value. But generally, that's not the way we see it implemented in our community.
Yeah, so I agree that it has to show in the general ledger, because the general ledger is a backward-looking thing,
Yeah.
right? It always looks at what happened,
Right.
where decision-making is always in the future.
Yep.
So the way to get things to show up in the general ledger is to understand avoidability and unavoidability,
Totally agree.
and make the decision based on that, and it will show up in the general ledger.
Yeah.
But there's no ways that information that is used to make decisions in the future should be compromised by what's in the rear view mirror.
All right. Well, gentlemen, I want to thank you. We've reached kind of the end of our time. I think we've covered a lot of ground, seen a lot of had a lot of insights about how information can be used by IT organizations to improve their decision making, and covered a lot of the issues that the users of those informations, the creators of those models and informations, need to evaluate and consider. One of the important things that PACE focuses on is elevating the importance of managerial information as opposed to just financial accounting information, and identify some of the dangers that can happen if you simply use financial accounting information to make internal decisions. So just to wrap this up, we want to invite PACE is an active and growing community. You are invited to engage via our website, our website forum, our various interest groups on the website, monthly webinars and town halls, and via our LinkedIn site. We encourage you to connect and join our conversation. Here's where you can find us. And we want to thank you very much for attending today's events. We have another event coming up later this month on revenue management. Please check our website, check our LinkedIn page, and consider joining that discussion and that webinar to learn more about important topics as you pursue improved information for decision support in your organization. Rafe, did you have any final comments you wanted to make?
No, just except to thank everybody for attending today's webinar. You can find lots of other great information on our website. If you haven't joined as a member of that, I'd like to encourage everyone to do that. And again, thank you, Todd. It was a great discussion, and thank you, Anton. You both are just so knowledgeable and really had a great discussion today.
Yeah, thank you, Rafe, Larry, Anton. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you, Todd.